The first warning did not come as fire in the sky or fleets tearing out of hyperspace. It came as absence. Across the galaxy, hyperspace lanes that had functioned without interruption for thousands of years simply failed. Not collapsed, not disrupted, failed. Navigation computers returned clean readings that led nowhere. Ships attempting to jump vanished into nothing or slammed back into real space with shredded hulls and dead crews. Commerce froze in a single breath, and worlds that had never learned how to exist without constant movement suddenly found themselves isolated, exposed, and afraid. The Jedi felt the disturbance before the alarms finished sounding. It struck the Force like a scream stretched across infinity, not localized to one planet or sector, but everywhere at once. Masters in deep meditation were violently torn back into consciousness, their calm shattered by visions that refused to cohere. Padawans staggered as if struck, overwhelmed by sensations that did not belong to this galaxy alone, echoes of minds, wills, and powers pressing in from elsewhere. The Force did not guide them through it. It recoiled alongside them, strained and uncertain. On active battlefronts, confusion detonated into chaos. Clone and separatist fleets, already locked in combat, watched space twist around them, stars elongating and folding in on themselves as gravity behaved like a living thing. Capital ships drifted off vectors despite full power to their engines. Targeting systems lost coherence. Artificial gravity failed on multiple vessels, sending soldiers and droids alike slamming into bulkheads as the void itself seemed to reject the structures imposed upon it. No enemy had fired a shot, yet entire engagements were already lost. Then reality split. Jagged ruptures tore open directly in real space, luminous scars stretching across the void with no hyperspace signature and no detectable mass. They pulsed irregularly, expanding and contracting as though reacting to unseen pressure from the other side. Sensors could not agree on their size or shape, and visual confirmation made them worse, not better. The fractures displayed colors no spectrum could classify, light bending into impossible angles that made prolonged observation physically painful. Every known law of astrophysics failed simultaneously, replaced by something older and far less forgiving. From the first rupture, something descended. It did not arrive as a ship. It did not burn like debris. It fell with intention, slowing against gravity that should have crushed it, wrapped in energy that crackled with authority rather than heat. Thunder rolled across clear skies as the figure touched down, the ground responding as if it recognized a higher claim to dominance. Weapons locked onto the impact zone failed. Communications dissolved into static. Every living being nearby felt the same instinctive reaction take hold. This presence did not belong to their world, and yet it was unquestionably real. Elsewhere, the arrivals took other forms. On an outer rim moon, an armored figure struck the surface with meteor force and rose from the crater unbroken. Above a densely populated core world, a human-shaped blur tore through regulated traffic lanes faster than any interceptor. Sonic booms shattering transparent steel towers before emergency shields could deploy. In deep space near neutral system, something vast and radiant emerged partway through a rupture, its form incomplete, its presence bending gravity so violently that nearby cruisers spun helplessly, hulls groaning under stresses no inertial dampener could compensate for. The Force reacted violently to every convergence. In some regions, it surged without restraint, amplifying Jedi abilities beyond safe thresholds and burning out unprepared minds. In others, it vanished entirely, creating dead zones where Force-sensitive beings felt severed from a part of themselves they had never imagined losing. Ancient temples went dormant. Sith artifacts shrieked and then fell silent. Holocrons that had endured for millennia cracked under pressure they were never meant to withstand. It became clear that this was not merely an invasion of beings, but a collision of fundamental truths. Even the Sith were forced into uncertainty, hidden beneath layers of deception and ritual. Darth Sidious felt his carefully cultivated foresight unravel. Futures that had once been clear and malleable collapsed into fog. Paths he had guided for decades no longer resolved into outcomes he could predict. For the first time in his long ascent, the dark side did not offer clarity, only possibility. Power on this scale represented either annihilation or apotheosis, and the distinction was suddenly impossible to determine. Governments fractured under the weight of incomplete information. The Republic Senate descended into chaos as accusations flew faster than verified reports. Some blamed secret superweapons. Others accused the Jedi themselves of losing control of forces they barely understood. The Separatist leadership issued contradictory orders, torn between exploiting the disruption and fearing what might emerge next. Trade routes collapsed overnight, triggering shortages and unrest on worlds that had never known scarcity. Refugees began moving without waiting for explanations, driven by the simple understanding that staying still was dangerous. Among ordinary citizens, the sky became a source of terror and reverence in equal measure. On frontier worlds, unfamiliar constellations warped into view as ruptures distorted starlight. On ecumenopolises, cult movements formed within hours, proclaiming the arrivals as gods, demons, or harbingers of final judgment. Ancient myths resurfaced with alarming speed, filling the vacuum left by shattered science and failing institutions. When beings fell from the heavens wielding impossible power, belief adapted faster than reason ever could. The Jedi Council convened in emergency session, but unity proved impossible. Some masters argued that the convergence was a natural, if catastrophic, evolution of the Force itself. Others declared it an abomination that must be undone regardless of cost. Shared visions contradicted one another, salvation and extinction intertwined, heroes and tyrants indistinguishable in the chaos. For perhaps the first time in its history, the Order confronted a crisis in which the Force offered no clear guidance, only reaction. Patterns began to emerge as the ruptures multiplied. They appeared near conflict, near power, near significance, as if drawn to intensity itself. Battlefields, ancient ruins, capital worlds, forgotten strongholds. Whatever lay beyond the fractures was not spilling randomly into the galaxy. It was intersecting with it at points of maximum consequence, weaving realities together where the outcome would matter most. If you want to see more gods, heroes, and legends collide with the Star Wars galaxy in stories like this, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see next in the comments below. By the time the galaxy began to grasp the scope of what was unfolding, one truth had already settled into place. This was not a war that could be won with fleets or doctrines. This was not an invasion that could be repelled. Entire universes were colliding, forced into coexistence by forces beyond comprehension. Gods walked among mortals. Heroes fell into a galaxy bound by the Force, and the Force itself strained to redefine reality around them. The galaxy had not been conquered. It had been rewritten. The first attempts to understand the catastrophe relied on classification, and classification failed immediately. Republic intelligence, accustomed to cataloging threats by fleet strength, political alignment, or technological signature, found itself drowning in reports that refused to fit any framework. Arrivals did not conform to ship registries or known species profiles. Energy readings contradicted themselves. Some beings registered as living stars on sensors, while others appeared biologically unremarkable yet performed feats that eclipsed the output of capital ship reactors. The galaxy's oldest institutions discovered that their most reliable tools, measurement, precedent, doctrine, were suddenly useless. On a mid-rim agri-world that had escaped major conflict for generations, the sky split open above golden plains. What emerged was not a vessel, but a figure wreathed in light, descending slowly as gravity bowed beneath them. When Republic security forces arrived, blasters failed to discharge within several meters of the landing site. Power cells drained dry as if consumed by proximity alone. The figure spoke, not aloud, but directly into the minds of those present, using concepts rather than words. It did not threaten. It declared presence. Moments later, the rupture sealed behind it, leaving no trace beyond scorched earth and a permanent disturbance in the local force that Jedi investigators would later describe as overexposed, as if reality itself had been forced to look directly into something too bright. Elsewhere, the collisions were violent. A separatist listening post on the edge of known space was obliterated when a foreign warship tore out of a fracture at relativistic speed, slamming through the station and continuing on without slowing. The vessel bore no resemblance to any galactic design philosophy. Its hull was smooth, seamless, and alive with shifting symbols that reacted to incoming fire by rewriting themselves. Droid squadrons dispatched to intercept it were erased in bursts of energy that bent around shields and ignored armor entirely. Before reinforcements could arrive, the ship vanished, not into hyperspace, but simply out of existence, leaving behind a gravity wake that collapsed to nearby moons. Fragments did not always arrive whole. Entire cities appeared fused into asteroids, their architectures alien and scarred by unknown wars. Biomes dropped into oceans where incompatible ecosystems clashed violently, spawning storms that scoured coastlines clean. Creatures unlike anything cataloged by the Jedi archives prowled jungle worlds, their presence warping the force around them into unfamiliar patterns. Some radiated power akin to the dark side without malice. Others felt profoundly light-aligned, yet inspired fear rather than comfort. It became clear that morality itself was no longer a reliable compass. The Jedi were dispatched in small, overwhelmed teams to assess and contain what they could. On one such mission, a group of knights encountered a lone warrior standing amid the wreckage of a crashed foreign craft. The being wore no armor and carried a simple blade, yet moved with precision that forced seasoned lightsaber practitioners onto the defensive within seconds. The Force did not flow through this warrior in any recognizable way. Instead, their presence displaced it, creating pockets of resistance where telekinesis failed and precognition went blind. When the encounter ended, the warrior withdrew without killing anyone, leaving behind a single statement spoken calmly in Basic. Your galaxy is not prepared for what follows. Not all encounters were hostile. In the depths of the criminal underworld, information brokers began whispering about individuals who paid in impossible currencies, knowledge of futures that never occurred, technologies that violated conservation laws, cures for diseases that did not exist in this reality. Smugglers reported being saved from Imperial patrols by unseen forces, their ships nudged out of danger by hands that never appeared on sensors. Entire pirate fleets vanished overnight after crossing paths with entities that treated them as insignificant obstacles rather than adversaries. Power had entered the galaxy in forms that did not recognize its hierarchies. The Sith adapted faster than most, while the Jedi struggled to define the arrivals in terms of balance and harmony. Sith agents moved to capture, bargain, and exploit. Dark side cultists flocked to convergence zones, convinced that ancient prophecies were unfolding at last. On a dead world once used for forbidden experiments, a Sith Lord oversaw the binding of an outsider entity into a containment lattice forged from Kyber and blood rites. The process killed everyone involved except the Sith, and even then, the entity escaped hours later, tearing the facility apart as if it had merely been inconvenienced. The dark side had not gained a servant. It had announced itself as insufficient. Across the galaxy, the Force itself began to fracture along unfamiliar lines. Jedi healers reported patients whose injuries resisted treatment not because they were severe, but because their wounds followed principles the Force did not recognize. Visions grew contradictory. A single meditation could reveal salvation, catastrophe, and irrelevance all at once, depending on which presence brushed against the seer's awareness. Some Force-sensitive children displayed abilities that mirrored the arrivals rather than traditional Jedi disciplines, bending probability or manifesting constructs without drawing from emotional states associated with light or dark. The Order quietly began isolating these children, unsure whether they represented evolution or contamination. Military doctrine collapsed next. Traditional fleet engagements became liabilities when opponents could ignore shields, rewrite physics locally, or simply walk through vacuum unharmed. Admirals hesitated to deploy capital ships near convergence zones, fearing that attention itself might attract something worse. Smaller, more flexible task forces were assembled, pairing clones with unconventional specialists, Jedi, bounty hunters, engineers willing to improvise without schematics. The galaxy learned to fight without understanding, reacting instead of planning. Civilian populations suffered most. Entire worlds found themselves abruptly important, transformed into strategic flashpoints simply because something had arrived there. Refugee crises multiplied as planets were abandoned at the first sign of instability. Religious movements grew more extreme, some worshipping the arrivals, others demanding their destruction at any cost. On Coruscant, protests turned violent as citizens accused the Jedi of failing in their sacred duty to protect the galaxy from existential threats. Faith in old institutions eroded rapidly, replaced by fear-driven allegiance to anyone who seemed capable of imposing order. Amid the chaos, a troubling realization emerged among those studying the patterns closely. The arrivals were not random. They were not explorers or invaders reacting to opportunity. They were responses. Something about the Star Wars galaxy, its reliance on the Force, its long cycles of light and dark, its unresolved imbalances, had acted like a signal flare across realities. Gods, heroes, and entities of unimaginable power were not merely colliding here. They were being drawn. And as more fragments continued to fall into place, one unsettling question began to take hold in the minds of Jedi and Sith alike. If these beings were the consequence, not the cause, then what had the galaxy done to deserve their attention? The Jedi Council convened in emergency session beneath the high spires of Coruscant, but the chamber that had once symbolized clarity and balance now felt strained, its calm geometry unable to contain the tension pressing in from every side. The Force itself seemed unsettled within the room, currents tugging unpredictably at even the most disciplined minds. Masters who had weathered wars, schisms, and Sith resurgences found their meditations interrupted by impressions that refused to resolve. No consensus formed before the first words were spoken, and by the time the session ended, the order would be more divided than it had been in centuries. The oldest masters spoke first, their voices measured but unmistakably alarmed. They described the arrivals not as invaders, but as violations, foreign presences that did not merely exist within the Force, but displaced it, carving hollows where intuition failed and surges where serenity once prevailed. To them, this was not evolution. It was contamination. The Force, they argued, was the binding fabric of the galaxy, and anything that disrupted its harmony on this scale threatened existence itself. Their solution was clear in principle, even if impossible in practice. The convergence had to be reversed, sealed, or excised, no matter the cost. Others challenged that framing immediately. Younger masters and several knights elevated by necessity during the Clone Wars argued that the Force had always been adaptive, that its history was one of response rather than preservation. They pointed to ancient eras when hyperspace itself had been unstable, when new Force traditions had emerged from contact with the unknown. To them, the arrivals were not aberrations, but data points, evidence that the galaxy was part of a larger cosmic system the Jedi had never fully understood. To destroy what they did not comprehend would be the height of arrogance. The debate fractured further when field reports were introduced. Holo recordings showed Jedi struggling against opponents who neither resisted nor embraced the Force, but sidestepped it entirely. Lightsabers passed through projected constructs that were neither illusions nor matter. Mind tricks failed not because of mental resistance, but because the target's cognition followed unfamiliar rules. In one recording, a master attempted to shield a civilian population from an energy surge, only to have the Force itself recoil. His connection severed momentarily, as if unplugged. He survived, but the echo of that loss lingered in the chamber, a shared shudder among those who felt it through the Force. Some masters saw these failures as proof of danger. Others saw them as proof of stagnation. The Jedi had grown accustomed to being the ultimate arbiters of power and morality within the galaxy. Now they were confronted with entities who neither feared nor revered them. The Order's authority was no longer assumed. It had to be earned or it would be ignored entirely. A proposal emerged to isolate convergence zones under Jedi supervision, restricting access and preventing exploitation by the Sith or criminal syndicates. On paper, it was a measured response. In reality, it exposed another rift. Several council members questioned whether the Jedi had the right or the capacity to contain phenomena they barely understood. Reports already indicated that some zones reacted violently to concentrated force use, destabilizing further when too many Jedi gathered in one place. What if containment made things worse? The issue of force-sensitive children intensified the conflict. Across the galaxy, initiates were being identified whose abilities did not align with established disciplines. Some manipulated probability unconsciously. Others manifested energy constructs without emotional catalysts. A few displayed an intuitive grasp of these new arrivals, communicating or resonating with them in ways the Jedi could not replicate. Traditionalists demanded immediate separation, fearing corruption or infiltration. Reformists countered that these children represented the future, a bridge between realities that could prevent catastrophe. To reject them outright was to blind the Order at the moment vision was most needed. Underlying every argument was an unspoken fear, irrelevance. The Jedi had always defined themselves as guardians of peace and balance, but peace was evaporating faster than they could respond, and balance no longer meant what it once did. Some masters worried that clinging to old definitions would reduce the Order to ceremonial observers, respected for tradition but powerless in practice. Others feared that adaptation would erode the very principles that made the Jedi distinct, turning them into just another faction grasping for survival. The shadow of the Sith loomed over every exchange. Intelligence reports confirmed increased dark side activity near convergence zones, with cultists and agents attempting to bargain with or weaponize arrivals. The Council agreed on one point at least. The Sith were acting decisively, unconstrained by ethics or doubt. That realization cut both ways. It justified caution, but it also tempted some Jedi toward pragmatism bordering on compromise. If the Sith could exploit these forces, could the Jedi afford not to? A particularly heated moment arose when a master suggested direct dialogue with the most powerful arrivals, regardless of their nature. The idea of negotiating with beings some considered gods was anathema to many. Yet others argued that diplomacy had always been the Jedi's strength, that violence against incomprehensible entities would only accelerate disaster. The Force, after all, connected all living things. Surely that connection could be extended, translated, if approached with humility rather than authority. As the session dragged on, the Council began to fracture not just philosophically, but practically. Informal blocks formed, those advocating containment and reversal, those pushing for study and integration, and a quieter group who believed the Order should step back entirely, allowing the galaxy to respond organically. That last position was the most controversial of all. To relinquish control, even temporarily, felt like abdication. Yet its proponents argued that the Jedi's constant intervention might be exacerbating the very imbalances drawing these forces in. Outside the chamber, the galaxy did not wait for resolution. Reports of Jedi being bypassed, ignored, or outright challenged by non-Force-wielders emboldened planetary governments and local militias. If the Jedi could not protect them from gods and superheroes falling out of the void, what value did their council hold? Political pressure mounted, with senators demanding accountability and results rather than philosophy. The council felt that pressure keenly, even as they resisted being drawn into purely political decision-making. By the time the session ended, no unified doctrine had emerged. Instead, the council issued a deliberately vague directive, authorizing Jedi to exercise individual judgment in the field while avoiding unnecessary escalation. It was a compromise born of exhaustion rather than agreement. For the first time in generations, the Jedi Order acknowledged, if only implicitly, that it did not have all the answers. As the masters dispersed, each carried a different vision of the future. Some resolved to protect the Force from intrusion at any cost. Others committed themselves to learning from the outsiders, even if it meant redefining what it meant to be a Jedi. A few quietly wondered whether the Order itself was an artifact of a simpler universe, ill-suited to survive what was coming. Above Coruscant, the city planet's endless traffic flowed on, oblivious to the philosophical fault lines widening beneath its guardians. Somewhere beyond the stars, more fractures were forming, more entities being drawn toward a galaxy struggling to decide whether to resist change or be remade by it. And within the Force, a question echoed with growing urgency. Could balance exist in a universe that was no longer singular? While the Jedi debated definitions and doctrine, the Sith acted. They always did. In the shadows of the galaxy's unraveling, Darth Sidious felt the convergence not as a disruption, but as confirmation. For decades, he had sensed that the Force was straining against the limits imposed by the galaxy's narrow understanding of power. The arrival of gods, heroes, and entities untouched by Jedi philosophy did not frighten him. It validated him. This was proof that the Force was not the ultimate authority it pretended to be, merely one current in a far greater ocean, and Sidious intended to drown the galaxy in it. From the hidden sanctum beneath Coruscant, Sidious observed the fractures through instruments older than the Republic itself. Sith holocrons sang with unfamiliar harmonics. Kyber crystals resonated at frequencies that made lesser adepts bleed from the eyes. Where the Jedi felt interference, Sidious felt opportunity. These beings were not immune to power. They were simply attuned to different laws, and laws he knew could be bent, rewritten, or broken with sufficient will. Count Dooku became his primary instrument in this new phase of the war. Dispatched under the guise of diplomatic maneuvering, Dooku traveled to worlds near convergence zones, presenting himself as a philosopher rather than a warlord. To separatist-aligned systems terrified by instability, he offered order. To criminal syndicates eager to profit from chaos, he offered protection. And to the arrivals themselves, when contact was possible, he offered understanding. Dooku spoke not of Sith or Jedi, but of liberation from dogma, of a galaxy ripe for restructuring by those strong enough to seize the moment. On a shattered moon orbiting a dying star, Dooku made first contact with an entity worshipped by its followers as a god of storms. The being towered over the separatist delegation, its presence distorting gravity and pulling ionized clouds into a constant vortex around its form. Where Jedi emissaries would have sought balance, Dooku spoke of purpose. He acknowledged the being's power without reverence, framing it as a natural right rather than a moral burden. The conversation did not end in alliance, but it ended without violence, and that alone marked a victory. The Sith had proven they could speak the language of gods. Elsewhere, Sidious experimented. Sith alchemists were ordered to expose artifacts and living subjects to convergence energies, recording the results without regard for survival. Some test chambers imploded. Others birthed abominations that screamed in multiple voices before dissolving. But a few produced something far more valuable: hybrid effects, force lightning that phased through shields, mind control techniques that bypassed neurological defenses by rewriting probability instead of thought. Small successes, but enough to convince Sidious that mastery was possible. The rule of two, long a guiding principle, began to feel less like discipline and more like constraint. Sidious did not abandon it openly, but he bent it in practice. Dark side cultists, inquisitors, and experimental adepts were given fragments of forbidden knowledge, each taught just enough to be useful and disposable. The galaxy was becoming a laboratory, and the Sith its most ruthless researchers. The Jedi were not blind to this escalation. Reports filtered in of worlds where dark side activity had spiked dramatically. Convergence zones stabilized not through harmony, but through domination. Entire regions of space went quiet, their population subdued under regimes backed by outsiders who enforced order with terrifying efficiency. In some cases, these regimes were welcomed. After years of war and uncertainty, stability, even brutal stability, was seductive. Sidious understood that conquest was no longer purely military. It was ideological. The presence of gods and superheroes shattered the myth that the Jedi were the pinnacle of moral authority. The Sith did not need to defeat the Jedi outright if they could make them irrelevant. By positioning himself as the only figure willing to embrace the galaxy's new reality without fear, Sidious cultivated inevitability. He was not resisting change. He was becoming its architect. Dooku, for his part, began to feel the strain of this ambition. Encounters with the arrivals unsettled him in ways he did not admit. Some dismissed him as provincial, a relic of a smaller universe. Others saw through his rhetoric, recognizing the hunger beneath his composure. In one exchange with a warrior whose strength rivaled that of entire armies, Dooku glimpsed a future where the Sith were not rulers, but competitors in a hierarchy far more brutal than anything the Jedi had ever imposed. The thought disturbed him more than he expected. Yet he pressed on. The war demanded it. The Separatist Council, already fractured, grew increasingly dependent on Sith protection as convergence zones destabilized trade routes and manufacturing hubs. Dooku leveraged that dependence, consolidating power while publicly advocating restraint and negotiation. Privately, he funneled resources into projects designed to anchor convergence zones permanently, turning instability into infrastructure. If the galaxy was going to host gods, then the Sith would decide where they landed. Sidious began to prepare for direct engagement. Not conquest, not yet, but calibration. He orchestrated events designed to draw the attention of the most powerful arrivals, testing their responses to provocation, temptation, and threat. Entire fleets were sacrificed to gauge reaction times. Worlds were abandoned to see which beings intervened and which observed. Each response refined his understanding. Each data point brought him closer to a truth the Jedi refused to consider, that the Force might be just another weapon, and not even the most dangerous one. As the Sith moved from opportunism to orchestration, the galaxy crossed a threshold. This was no longer a crisis to be endured or studied. It was a transformation being guided by deliberate hands. Jedi hesitance, Republic paralysis, and civilian fear created the vacuum Sidious thrived in. Where others saw chaos, he saw raw material. And as more gods and heroes arrived, drawn ever deeper into the galaxy's gravitational and metaphysical pull, the Sith prepared to do what they had always done best. They would take something vast, unstable, and terrifying and teach it to kneel. The first worlds to truly burn were not the core or the great capitals of galactic history. They were the places no one rushed to defend. Trade junctions without centers of influence. Mining systems whose names never appeared in holodramas. Outer rim planets already hardened by neglect, corruption, and violence long before reality itself began to fracture. When gods, Jedi, and superheroes collided, it was these worlds that absorbed the impact first. The Republic's supply lines were the earliest casualties. Hyperlanes near convergence zones became unpredictable, sometimes shortening jumps by impossible margins, other times stretching a single route into a death trap where ships emerged light years off course or never emerged at all. Smugglers adapted faster than navicomputers. Criminal syndicates began mapping living lanes, routes that shifted subtly but consistently enough to be exploited by those willing to risk everything. Credits flowed. So did blood. On a dust-choked world ruled nominally by the Hutts, a convergence zone stabilized above the atmosphere like a wound that refused to close. Ships drifted in its gravity well, trapped between physics and something older. Refugees arrived in waves, fleeing systems where their governments had collapsed under the strain of impossible visitors and Jedi indecision. They brought stories of beings who could shatter cities, of battles where blaster fire meant nothing, of heroes who saved thousands and vanished without explanation. Fear became currency, and the underworld knew exactly how to spend it. Crime lords moved first. The Hutts were cautious, but Black Sun was not. Prince Zizor's successors saw convergence zones as monopolies waiting to be claimed. They hired mercenaries from across the galaxy, augmenting them with outsiders who demanded no loyalty beyond payment. Enhanced warriors stood guard over spice depots. Metahuman enforcers replaced entire platoons of hired guns. The balance of power shifted quietly, efficiently, and brutally. Bounty hunters thrived. The guild adapted its codes to accommodate targets no longer bound by known limitations. Contracts became speculative, layered with clauses for collateral damage, dimensional instability, and force-related interference. Some hunters refused these jobs outright. Others embraced them, seeing in the chaos a chance to carve legends that would outlive the war itself. Names like Fett, Bosk, and Ventress crossed paths with warriors from beyond the galaxy. Encounters that ended with mutual respect, grudging withdrawal, or scorched ground where neither side could claim victory. Mandalorians watched all of this with cold calculation. Clan leaders debated whether the arrivals were abominations or opportunities. The old wars against the Jedi had taught them one immutable truth. Power alone did not determine victory. Preparation did. Adaptation did. On hidden worlds, Beskar forges burned day and night as armor was reforged to withstand energies no smith had ever studied. Mandalorian scouts shadowed convergence zones, observing outsiders not as threats or saviors, but as future opponents. One such encounter changed everything. A Mandalorian strike team crossed paths with a being whose strength rivaled artillery and whose speed defied targeting systems. The clash lasted minutes and destroyed half a city block. When it ended, both sides withdrew, wounded but alive. The Mandalorians did not claim victory. They claimed data. Within weeks, new weapon prototypes appeared, tuned not to the Force, but to probability distortions and energy signatures alien to the galaxy. Word spread quickly. The Mandalorians were preparing for a war no one else had the courage to imagine. Neutral systems became battlegrounds not because they chose sides, but because they refused to. Governors who tried to bar outsiders found their orbital defenses irrelevant. Jedi intervention was inconsistent, delayed by council debate and stretched resources. Republic fleets prioritized strategic worlds, leaving others to negotiate their own survival. Some struck deals with criminal syndicates. Others invited gods to act as protectors, worship replacing citizenship almost overnight. These arrangements never lasted. Gods demanded reverence or obedience. Superheroes demanded reform that threatened entrenched elites. Criminals demanded profit. Every compromise sowed the seeds of rebellion. Riots erupted in cities where populations split between gratitude and fear. Temples were built and burned within the same standard week. The galaxy's social fabric, already strained by war, began to tear in unpredictable patterns. The Force itself responded unevenly. On some worlds it grew muted, as if overwhelmed by too many competing echoes. Jedi reported difficulty meditating, their visions clouded by images that did not belong to any known future. On other planets, the Force surged violently, amplifying emotions until minor disputes escalated into massacres. Dark side nexuses bloomed in places with no historical precedent, fed not by Sith ritual, but by collective despair and awe. In the absence of clear authority, new factions emerged. Cult leaders claiming visions of salvation gathered followers around outsiders willing to play the role of Messiah. Mercenary companies rebranded as stability contractors, offering protection from both gods and governments. Independent Force-sensitive sects rejected Jedi and Sith alike, experimenting with philosophies drawn from observing the arrivals. The galaxy became a mosaic of ideologies, each convinced it represented the only path forward. The Jedi attempted intervention, but each mission carried risk. When they acted too forcefully, they were accused of trying to reassert dominance over a galaxy that had outgrown them. When they hesitated, worlds fell under the control of entities far less restrained. Jedi Knights found themselves negotiating ceasefires between criminals and gods, mediating disputes where the Force offered no guidance, and facing populations who no longer saw them as guardians, but as relics of a simpler age. The Sith exploited every failure. Sidious ensured that instability persisted just long enough to delegitimize the Republic's authority, without allowing total collapse. Dooku's agents whispered promises of order to systems on the brink, offering separatist protection backed by forces that could repel even the most powerful arrivals. Each world that accepted tightened the noose around the Republic's neck. By the time the Senate realized the Outer Rim was effectively lost, it was already too late. What remained was not lawless chaos, but a patchwork of micro-empires, each governed by a different philosophy of power. Some were ruled by fear, others by hope, most by necessity. The war between Republic and Separatists had become almost irrelevant compared to the silent conflict reshaping the galaxy from its edges inward. And in the heart of this slow-burning transformation, one truth became impossible to ignore. The galaxy was no longer fighting a war between governments. It was fighting a war over what power meant, who deserved it, and how much destruction was acceptable to claim the future. The Force did not remain a passive observer to the chaos consuming the galaxy. It never had. As gods, Jedi, and superheroes continued to collide across star systems, something ancient and self-correcting began to stir beneath the surface of reality itself. The Jedi would later struggle to name it. Some called it backlash. Others called it balance. A few, in frightened whispers, called it judgment. At first, the signs were subtle. Jedi reported moments where their connection to the Force flickered unexpectedly, like a signal passing through interference. Simple telekinetic feats required concentration they had not needed since childhood. Battle meditation unraveled mid-conflict, leaving clone battalions disoriented at the worst possible moments. Force visions arrived fragmented, stripped of context, filled with symbols that belonged to no Jedi tradition. The Order tried to interpret these disturbances as stress responses to unprecedented events. They were wrong. Then the Force began to push back. On a mid-rim world caught between two convergence zones, an entire valley vanished without explosion or warning. One moment it existed, home to 3 million sentients and a thriving trade hub. The next, it was a smooth basin of fused stone, as if reality itself had pressed delete. Sensors recorded no energy discharge, no hyperspace signatures, no conventional cause. Jedi who arrived afterward described the area as quiet, not dead, but emptied, as if the Force had withdrawn its presence entirely. Elsewhere, the opposite occurred. On a jungle moon where outsiders had been worshipped as living gods, the Force surged violently through the ecosystem. Flora grew at impossible rates, overtaking cities in days. Predators developed heightened awareness and coordination, hunting in patterns that mimicked tactical doctrine. Local Force sensitives, untrained and unprepared, became conduits for power they could not control. What began as miracles ended in catastrophe as entire settlements were consumed by runaway growth and uncontrolled energy release. The Jedi Council could no longer deny the pattern. The Force was not reacting randomly. It was responding to imbalance on a scale the galaxy had never experienced. Too many sources of power, too many competing narratives of destiny, too many beings exerting influence without belonging to the Force's underlying structure. The galaxy had become overcrowded with meaning. Attempts to stabilize affected regions only made matters worse. Jedi rituals designed to heal Force wounds sometimes amplified them, triggering spatial distortions or emotional feedback loops that drove populations into panic. In one infamous incident, a group of masters attempted a large-scale harmonization meditation near a convergence zone. The result was catastrophic. Half the masters were rendered unconscious, while the others emerged permanently altered. Their Force signatures fractured into unstable patterns that made them dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. These failures shook the Order deeply. Jedi had always believed that alignment with the Force granted insight into its will. Now that assumption was collapsing. The Force was acting on principles that seemed indifferent to Jedi philosophy. It erased entire regions without regard for innocence. It empowered others without regard for discipline. It forced choices that violated every moral framework the Jedi held sacred. Outside the Order, the effects were even more severe. Entire populations found themselves changed overnight. Some individuals gained abilities resembling those of the arriving superheroes, not through convergence exposure, but through proximity to Force backlash events. Others lost abilities they had relied on their entire lives. Pilots reported instincts vanishing mid-flight. Healers found their talents dulled or reversed, causing harm where they once brought relief. Identity itself became unstable. The Sith understood what the Jedi refused to accept. The Force was not merely correcting imbalance. It was testing boundaries. Sidious, observing from the shadows, recognized opportunity in this violence. If the Force was reshaping itself, then it could be guided, redirected, perhaps even mastered. His experiments grew bolder. Entire facilities were dedicated to studying backlash zones, sacrificing prisoners and expendable assets to map how reality responded under strain. Dooku, ever the philosopher, framed these events as proof of Jedi hypocrisy. He argued that the Force was revealing its true nature, uncaring and ruthless, and that only those strong enough to impose order deserved to survive. Separatist propaganda seized on backlash disasters as evidence that Jedi intervention caused suffering. Worlds already distrustful of the Order turned openly hostile, refusing Jedi assistance, and aligning with factions that promised protection through strength rather than balance. For the average citizen, none of the ideology mattered. What mattered was survival. Trade collapsed in regions deemed unstable. Refugee flows overwhelmed planets that had once prided themselves on neutrality. Entire species faced extinction, as their home systems became uninhabitable due to Force anomalies that made long-term habitation impossible. The galaxy's demographic map began to shift in ways no historian could fully track. Amid this turmoil, impossible moral choices emerged. On one world, the only way to stop a growing backlash zone was to evacuate millions and seal the planet behind a hyperspace interdiction field that would trap whatever forces were causing the instability inside. Doing so meant condemning thousands who could not be evacuated in time. The Jedi debated for days. The Force did not wait. When the decision was finally made, it was already too late. The backlash intensified, consuming not only the planet, but the surrounding system in a cascading collapse. Such failures haunted the survivors. Jedi Knights began to question whether intervention itself was the problem. Some walked away from the Order, believing that the Force demanded withdrawal rather than control. Others doubled down, convinced that only greater mastery could prevent total annihilation. The Council fractured further, its authority undermined not by Sith manipulation alone, but by the Force's apparent rejection of Jedi certainty. Stranger still were the regions where the Force seemed to adapt. In these zones, outsiders and Force sensitives began to interact in unprecedented ways. Superheroes found their abilities subtly altered, constrained by emotional resonance rather than physical limits. Gods discovered that their influence weakened when worship became coerced rather than freely given. The Force was not erasing them. It was integrating them on its own terms. These adaptive zones became laboratories of survival. New fighting styles emerged, blending martial discipline, superhuman capability, and Force intuition. Healers learned to work with fluctuating energy fields rather than against them. Philosophers proposed radical ideas, that the Force was not a constant, but a living narrative, reshaped by belief, conflict, and convergence. Such ideas were dismissed as heretical by traditionalists, but they spread rapidly among those living at the edge of annihilation. Reality itself began to feel less solid. Time dilation events caused weeks to pass in moments or moments to stretch into days. Memories shifted subtly, histories rewriting themselves at the margins. Entire battles were remembered differently by different participants, with no clear truth to anchor them. The Force was no longer merely influencing events. It was rewriting context. By the time the Jedi fully acknowledged the scale of what was happening, the galaxy had crossed an invisible threshold. The Force was no longer content to be wielded. It was asserting agency, forcing every being, mortal or divine, to confront a single, terrifying question. If the Force could choose who thrived and who vanished, what right did anyone have to call themselves its master? The pushback was only beginning. The alliances that formed next were not born of hope or shared ideology. They were forged in fear, necessity, and the growing realization that no single power, creed, or mythology could survive alone anymore. As convergence zones expanded and Force backlash intensified, the old lines that defined the galaxy began to dissolve. Jedi, Mandalorians, criminals, gods, superheroes, and outsiders who should never have trusted one another found themselves standing on the same battlefields, facing threats that did not care who they had once been. The first of these alliances emerged quietly, almost accidentally, on a fractured outer rim world caught between a Force surge and an incursion of off-world entities. A Jedi task group found itself overwhelmed by enemies immune to traditional Force techniques. Lightsabers passed through energy-formed bodies without resistance. Mind tricks failed entirely. Just as the Jedi prepared for annihilation, a Mandalorian mercenary unit intervened, deploying weapons calibrated not to disrupt matter, but probability itself. Technology developed from fragments of non-native universes. The battle ended not in victory, but survival. When the smoke cleared, neither side attacked the other. They did not part ways either. That moment marked a turning point. Survival now required complementary strengths rather than ideological purity. Jedi brought perception, precognition, and an ability to sense instability before it manifested. Mandalorians brought adaptability, technology unconstrained by Force dogma, and a cultural comfort with fighting gods as equals. Criminal syndicates contributed intelligence networks that spanned collapsing trade routes and refugee flows. Outsiders offered raw power and perspectives unshaped by galactic history. None trusted the others, but none could afford isolation. These coalitions were unstable by design. Meetings took place in shielded chambers, often with weapons drawn and contingency plans openly discussed. No single leader commanded absolute authority. Decisions were made through negotiation, coercion, and sometimes brute force. Yet despite the tension, these alliances endured longer than many expected. Each member understood that betrayal would invite annihilation not just from enemies, but from the Force itself, which seemed increasingly intolerant of reckless imbalance. One of the most controversial alliances formed between a sect of disillusioned Jedi and a group of superheroes whose powers had begun to fluctuate unpredictably. The Jedi offered training not in Force techniques, but in emotional regulation, discipline, and perception. In return, the superheroes provided physical capabilities that could operate even when the Force surged or receded unpredictably. Together, they developed hybrid tactics that stabilized regions long enough to evacuate populations or dismantle convergence anchors. This cooperation shocked the galaxy. Holonet footage of Jedi fighting alongside mass figures wielding unfamiliar powers ignited fierce debate. Traditionalists condemned it as sacrilege. Others saw it as evolution. For civilians caught in the crossfire, ideology mattered less than the fact that someone was finally holding the line. Not all alliances were heroic. Criminal empires adapted faster than most governments. Smugglers learned which convergence zones enhanced hyperspace travel and which tore ships apart. Cartels traded in artifacts ripped from collapsed realities, selling them to the highest bidder regardless of consequence. Some syndicates allied with gods who had lost worshippers, offering belief through fear in exchange for protection and power. Entire sectors fell under the control of these hybrid regimes, where divinity, crime, and survival blurred into a single authority. The Sith exploited these alliances with calculated precision. Rather than oppose them outright, they infiltrated them. Agents embedded themselves as mediators, strategists, and benefactors, subtly steering coalitions toward decisions that increased instability elsewhere. Each alliance that stabilized one region often destabilized another, feeding the larger cycle of imbalance that the Sith sought to control. Sidious understood that a fractured unity was more useful than open chaos. Even within the Jedi Order, unofficial alliances formed against Council directives. Knights stationed on the front lines ignored recall orders, choosing instead to remain with coalitions they believed were saving lives. Some masters quietly supported these decisions, providing resources without authorization. The Order was no longer a single entity, but a constellation of philosophies bound loosely by tradition rather than obedience. The most unlikely alliances emerged in places the Force itself seemed to avoid. In null zones where Force presence collapsed entirely, beings from multiple universes found common ground. Without divine influence, without precognition, without destiny whispering outcomes, cooperation became purely practical. Fighters relied on trust earned in combat. Leaders rose through competence rather than prophecy. These zones became incubators for a new way of existing in the galaxy, one that did not assume the Force would intervene or forgive mistakes. Yet these alliances carried a price. Cultural erosion accelerated. Mandalorian clans fractured over cooperation with Force users. Superheroes struggled with identity as their powers adapted to a reality governed by emotional resonance rather than physics alone. Jedi found their moral certainty eroding as they made compromises that would have been unthinkable before the collapse. Saving millions sometimes meant sacrificing thousands. Protecting one world meant abandoning another. Trust remained fragile. Betrayals occurred, sometimes catastrophic ones. A coalition that held an entire sector together collapsed overnight when one member attempted to harness a convergence core for personal gain. The resulting backlash consumed 3 systems and erased every record of the Alliance's existence, as if the Force itself had rejected the attempt to cheat equilibrium. Despite these failures, the Alliances persisted, evolving through necessity. They began to share information across former enemy lines, mapping instability patterns, cataloging entities immune to Force correction, and identifying zones where adaptation was possible. This informal network became more effective than any centralized authority, still clinging to pre-collapse structures. The galaxy entered a strange new phase. Wars still raged, but they were no longer defined by banners or empires. Conflict became localized, fluid, and deeply personal. Fighters did not ask what side someone was on, but what they could contribute to survival. Old enemies stood shoulder to shoulder against threats that defied classification. Old heroes made choices that would have once branded them villains. Through it all, the Force watched, adjusted, and waited. The alliances that should not have existed were doing something unprecedented. They were not trying to restore the old balance or impose a new one. They were learning how to live inside instability itself. And in doing so, they were setting the stage for a confrontation that would decide whether the galaxy would be reshaped through cooperation or torn apart by those who believed control was the only answer. The idea of reversal did not arrive as a revelation or a miracle. It emerged slowly, painfully, from fragments of failed experiments, half-destroyed archives, and the testimonies of beings who remembered realities that no longer fully existed. The galaxy did not discover a solution so much as it stumbled into the shape of one, and even then, no one could agree on whether it should ever be used. The first indication that the collapse could be influenced came from a convergence zone that behaved differently from all others. Instead of expanding or destabilizing, it oscillated, pulling fragments inward before releasing them unchanged. Jedi scholars studying the anomaly realized the Force was not fighting the collapse uniformly. In rare circumstances, it was containing it. This contradicted everything the Order believed about balance. The Force was not simply reacting. It was making choices. Further investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Convergence zones stabilized only when something essential was removed. A powerful entity vanished. A civilization collapsed completely. A living nexus of belief or fear ceased to exist. The galaxy began to understand the cost hidden behind stabilization. Reality could heal itself, but only by excising pieces that no longer fit the new equilibrium. This realization fractured the alliances more deeply than any battlefield loss. Saving the galaxy was no longer about defeating an enemy. It was about deciding who or what deserved to remain. The Jedi Council, already weakened, found itself paralyzed. Traditional doctrine offered no guidance for choosing lives as currency. The Sith, by contrast, understood immediately. To them, sacrifice was not a tragedy, but a tool. If a collapse demanded loss, then they would choose the losses themselves and ensure those losses empowered them. Sidious began hunting for convergence cores, locations where multiple realities overlapped so completely that removing a single anchor could collapse entire layers of existence. Heroes from other universes faced their own reckoning. Many realized their presence alone was destabilizing reality. Their powers resonated too strongly, bending the force around them in ways that amplified collapse patterns. Some tried to suppress their abilities. Others isolated themselves in null zones. A few made the ultimate choice and vanished into convergence storms willingly, hoping their removal might spare worlds they had come to protect. Gods reacted with rage, fear, and denial. Worship sustained them, and belief now spanned fractured realities. To be chosen as a sacrifice meant more than death. It meant erasure from memory, myth, and meaning. Some gods attempted to consolidate belief aggressively, waging wars not for territory, but for faith. Others withdrew, severing themselves from worshippers to minimize their impact, fading into obscurity as mortal as those who once prayed to them. As evidence mounted, a grim consensus formed among the most informed factions. Total reversal was possible, but only once. The galaxy could not be restored piece by piece. The collapse had to be resolved through a single, catastrophic correction that would determine what remained and what was lost forever. Anything left outside that correction would be erased, not displaced. The question of who would decide became the most dangerous conflict yet. Republic leadership argued for a structured approach, attempting to quantify lives, worlds, and influence. Criminal syndicates saw opportunity, offering to sell protection from selection they could not actually guarantee. Mandalorian leaders rejected the premise entirely, arguing that survival through strength was more honest than cosmic arbitration. The Jedi were split between those who believed sacrifice was necessary and those who believed choosing sacrifices was the ultimate betrayal of the Force. In secret, smaller coalitions formed around a radical idea. Instead of choosing who would be removed, they would choose who would remain. This distinction mattered. By anchoring reality around specific constants rather than eliminating variables, they hoped to allow the Force to collapse excess realities naturally without targeted erasure. It was a gamble, one that risked accelerating destruction if it failed. Experiments began in hidden systems. Anchors were established around emotionally resonant points. Acts of selfless protection, unbreakable bonds between individuals, moments of collective resolve. In some cases, convergent storms weakened. In others, they intensified violently, consuming entire test sites. The Force was not indifferent to intent. It reacted strongly to motivation, amplifying both hope and desperation. The Sith intervened at the most critical moment. Sidious revealed himself not as a destroyer, but as a savior offering certainty. He proposed a controlled reversal under Sith stewardship, promising survival for those who pledged loyalty. Entire factions wavered. Fear made even enemies consider the unthinkable. If annihilation was inevitable, perhaps survival under tyranny was preferable. This offer exposed the core truth of the crisis. The cost of reversal was not only measured in lives or worlds, but in identity. Whoever guided the correction would define what the galaxy became afterward. Values, power structures, even the nature of the Force itself could be reshaped in that moment. Some alliances collapsed under the weight of that realization. Others hardened. Individuals who had once fought for survival now prepared to fight for meaning. Jedi who had questioned their purpose found clarity in resistance. Heroes rediscovered why they fought in the first place. Even gods were forced to confront what they represented beyond worship. The galaxy stood on the edge of an irreversible decision. Every battle, every alliance, every sacrifice now fed into a single approaching convergence that would either stabilize existence or end it permanently. There would be no undoing the choice once it was made. And somewhere within the growing storm, the Force began to shift, not as an abstract energy, but as something almost attentive, as if waiting to see who would prove worthy of shaping the future that would follow. The convergence did not announce itself with spectacle at first. There was no single explosion, no blinding tear across the stars. Instead, the galaxy began to feel heavy, as though existence itself was drawing a slow, deliberate breath. Hyperspace lanes grew unreliable. The Force became dense, almost viscous, resisting even the simplest acts of perception. Sensitive beings across countless systems reported the same sensation. Something vast was gathering its will. The final convergence formed in a region that should not have existed. It was not marked on any star chart, imperial or otherwise. A lattice of broken realities overlapped there, planets half-phased into one another, stars bleeding unfamiliar light, fragments of myth and history suspended like debris in a cosmic undertow. This was not merely a battlefield. It was the wound itself. Every faction that understood what was coming converged on that space, drawn by fear, ambition, or resolve. Republic task forces arrived alongside battered Jedi vessels. Sith armadas emerged from hidden hyperspace vectors. Mandalorian fleets formed brutal, defensive spheres. Independent heroes slipped in through collapsing corridors of reality. Even gods manifested directly, abandoning avatars and intermediaries, knowing distance no longer offered safety. At the heart of the convergence lay the axis point, the singular moment where correction could occur. It was not a device, nor a throne, nor a weapon. It was an alignment of will. Whoever shaped that moment would not command the galaxy by decree. They would redefine the conditions under which reality continued. Sidious moved first. He did not arrive with thunder or armies. He arrived with certainty. The Sith Lord emerged at the axis, surrounded by distortions that bent toward him instinctively, as though the collapse recognized something familiar in his presence. His mastery of fear, control, and inevitability resonated with the fracture itself. He did not seek to stop the collapse. He sought to complete it on his terms. He offered order. A galaxy narrowed, stripped of excess, governed by survival of will. Gods bound or erased. Heroes reduced to symbols or tools. The Force reshaped into something obedient, no longer wild or impartial. Under him, reality would endure because nothing would be allowed to challenge its structure again. Opposition came immediately, but not as a unified front. That was the tragedy of the moment. Jedi attacked to preserve balance. Mandalorians struck to prevent domination. Heroes fought to protect innocence. Gods clashed to preserve their domains. Each fought for a different vision of survival, and the convergence fed on that fragmentation. The battle defied conventional understanding. Blaster fire curved into other timelines. Lightsabers met weapons that should not have existed. Divine energy clashed with the dark side, tearing holes through memory itself. When gods fell, they did not die cleanly. Their myths unraveled mid-battle, rewriting their own pasts as they collapsed into absence. Several heroes attempted to reach the axis independently, believing personal sacrifice might override Sidious's control. Some succeeded in touching the convergence, only to be rejected violently. The collapse did not want random heroism. It demanded coherence. Purpose aligned with consequence. The turning point came not through power, but refusal. A small, disparate group reached the axis together, not as rulers, not as conquerors, but as anchors. Jedi who had abandoned dogma, heroes who had accepted limitation, gods who had willingly severed themselves from worship, even beings with no great power at all, whose only contribution was the choice to stand and not flee. They did not try to command the convergence. They did not try to define the galaxy's future in detail. Instead, they made a single declaration through action. Existence would continue without guarantees of dominance, immortality, or absolute control. Survival would not belong to the strongest will alone. The Force reacted violently. Sidious struck with everything he had, channeling the collapse itself as a weapon. For a moment, it seemed inevitable that his vision would prevail. But the convergence began to destabilize around him. His strength, absolute and consuming, created rigidity. The correction required flexibility, adaptation, acceptance of loss without ownership of it. As the axis shifted, the cost was finally paid. Entire realities folded inward, not selected by decree, but released because they could no longer coexist with the emerging equilibrium. Several gods vanished completely, their names dissolving from memory even as their final screams echoed through the Force. Some heroes were erased mid-action, their sacrifices unnoticed by history, but essential to survival. A handful of Star Wars worlds ceased to exist, their absence leaving quiet gaps where stars should have been. Sidious resisted erasure longer than any other being. His defiance was legendary, his will unmatched. But the convergence did not destroy him. It did something worse. It rendered him irrelevant. The corrected reality no longer required an architect of fear. His influence unraveled, his presence thinning until he was no more than a shadow of a possibility that might have been. When the convergence collapsed inward, it did so silently. The battle ended not with victory cries, but with exhaustion. Fleets drifted in the aftermath, counting who remained. The Force slowly began to move again, lighter, unfamiliar, altered in ways no one could yet define. Hyperspace stabilized. The stars held their positions. Reality had chosen. But what it had become was something entirely new. The galaxy did not celebrate its survival. There were no declarations of victory transmitted across hyperspace, no grand assemblies to mark the end of the impossible war. What followed the convergence was quieter, more unsettling. Survival itself felt provisional, as though reality was still deciding whether it would remain stable or ask for more. In the days that followed, the Force behaved differently. Jedi across surviving enclaves reported that it no longer flowed with the same clarity it once had. Precognition dulled at the edges. Visions became fragmented, unreliable, more symbolic than prophetic. The Force was still present, still vast, but it no longer positioned itself as an unquestioned guide. It listened more than it spoke. For the first time in recorded history, the Jedi could not claim certainty about the future or even their place within it. The Jedi Order fractured not through betrayal, but through honest disagreement. Some masters believed the Force's altered nature was punishment for centuries of arrogance, proof that the Order had mistaken stewardship for ownership. Others feared that without their traditional authority, the galaxy would descend into chaos unchecked. Several enclaves chose isolation, dedicating themselves to rediscovering what it meant to serve without control. Others disbanded entirely, their members choosing to walk the galaxy as individuals rather than symbols. The Sith, as an institution, did not survive the correction. The collapse had stripped away the underlying structure that rewarded domination above all else. Dark side practitioners still existed, but the ideology of inevitable supremacy no longer resonated with reality itself. Attempts to recreate the old hierarchies failed repeatedly, not because they were hunted down, but because the galaxy no longer bent toward them. Ambition remained possible. Absolute tyranny did not. Mandalorians adapted faster than most. Their culture, built on resilience and identity rather than cosmic entitlement, found strange harmony in the new equilibrium. Without gods to challenge or Sith to dominate, Mandalorian clans expanded their influence as stabilizing forces in unstable regions. Not conquerors, but enforcers of negotiated order. Their armor became a symbol not just of war, but of survival earned without divine favor. The criminal underworld flourished briefly, mistaking the galaxy's uncertainty for opportunity. That illusion did not last. Without predictable power structures to exploit, syndicates collapsed under their own ambition. Independent operators endured, but large-scale exploitation became increasingly difficult. Worlds scarred by the convergence developed a fierce resistance to external control, their populations having witnessed too much loss to surrender autonomy easily. As for the gods who remained, they were diminished by choice or necessity. Worship no longer amplified power in the same way. Belief became personal rather than systemic. Some deities withdrew entirely, retreating into obscurity, their influence reduced to quiet whispers rather than commands. Others adapted, walking among mortals not as rulers, but as participants. A few chose mortality outright, severing their last anchors to eternity in exchange for relevance in the new reality. Heroes faced perhaps the most difficult reckoning. In a galaxy no longer shaped by prophecy or destiny, their actions carried weight without assurance of meaning. Many returned to their own fractured universes if such paths remained. Others stayed, finding purpose not in saving everything, but in choosing what to protect. Their legends faded quickly, not because they failed, but because the galaxy refused to elevate individuals above the collective cost of survival. Entire regions bore scars that would never heal. Systems near the convergence axis existed in altered states, physics subtly distorted, cultures reshaped by memories of impossible skies and vanished neighbors. Some worlds lost entire histories, their people sensing absences they could not name. Memorials were built for things no longer remembered, honoring loss without understanding it. The Force itself became something closer to a mirror than a guide. It reflected intent rather than prescribing outcomes. Those who approached it with domination found resistance. Those who approached it with humility found resonance, though never certainty. Balance was no longer a state to be achieved. It was an ongoing negotiation between will, consequence, and restraint. In the centuries that followed, scholars would argue endlessly about whether the convergence was a catastrophe narrowly survived or a necessary correction delayed too long. There would be no consensus. Records were incomplete. Testimonies contradicted one another. Entire perspectives vanished with those who had held them. What remained undeniable was this: the galaxy had been given no ruler, no prophecy, no guarantee. It had been given responsibility, and in that responsibility lay both terror and freedom. A future unwritten, not because it was protected, but because no one was allowed to own it outright. Gods no longer stood above it. Jedi no longer defined it. Heroes no longer overshadowed it. The galaxy endured because it learned to carry itself. The collision of gods, Jedi, and superheroes was never truly about power. It was about control, belief, and the dangerous comfort of certainty. For generations, the galaxy had relied on structures that promised order through dominance or destiny. The Jedi trusted the Force to guide them. The Sith sought to bend it. Gods demanded reverence. Heroes carried the burden of inevitability, believing that if they fought hard enough, the right outcome would always follow. The convergence stripped all of that away. What the galaxy faced was not an invasion, but a reckoning. When beings of absolute power collided with a universe governed by balance, reality itself rejected absolutes. No ideology emerged victorious. No faction earned the right to define the future alone. Survival came not from strength, but from restraint, from the willingness to accept limits, even when those limits felt unjust. The Jedi learned that wisdom without humility becomes tyranny in slow motion. Their fall was not caused by gods or outsiders, but by the realization that they had mistaken tradition for truth. Those who endured did so by abandoning certainty, choosing service without authority. The Sith failed because the galaxy itself no longer rewarded domination. Ambition still existed, but it could no longer overwrite consequence. Power without balance simply collapsed inward. The gods discovered something far more unsettling than defeat. They discovered irrelevance. Worship, once a source of endless strength, became optional. Mortals chose meaning over obedience. Some gods adapted, others faded, and a few chose to become small so they could remain real. In doing so, they learned what the Jedi and Sith never fully grasped. Influence earned is stronger than control enforced. Heroes faced the quietest tragedy. In a galaxy without destiny, their sacrifices no longer guaranteed triumph. They had to choose who to save, knowing the universe would not validate their choices. And yet, that choice gave their actions more weight than any prophecy ever could. They became protectors, not saviors. Guardians of moments, not architects of fate. The Force itself endured, altered but alive. No longer a voice dictating outcomes, it became a reflection of intent. It did not reward righteousness automatically, nor punish ambition indiscriminately. It asked one question, endlessly repeated through action rather than words. What are you willing to live with? In the end, the galaxy did not emerge stronger or weaker. It emerged honest, free of gods who demanded worship, orders that claimed authority, and heroes burdened by inevitability. What followed was uncertainty, fear, and possibility in equal measure. A future shaped not by those who could command it, but by those willing to carry it.